Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Mark. Yet another windy and cold morning, unfortunately, and the footy finals are not far away either, are they?
They're not far away, and I'm hoping Geelong, and we'll know by the time this goes to air, we'll know whether Geelong have won or not.
Will be 1 week ago, I would, would
So
suggest.
it'd be good to see.
Yeah.
So this morning we're in the old city of Greater Geelong Town Hall, sitting with Jeremy Crawford, the CEO of the Chamber. And it's interesting because Jeremy approached us and said, listen, how close are you to 100 podcasts? And we said, well, we're very close. And we've just ticked over 100 podcasts. And he said, I've got an idea. So here we are today.
And we are the interviewees because Jeremy is the host. And we're here ready to be bombarded with, I hope, not so many tricky questions.
So, Jeremy, we'll hand over to you.
Oh, thank you both. And probably worth sharing that I did mention it'd be worth getting some special guests or someone incredible for you to celebrate your 100th podcast. And I can't think of any better special guest than yourselves. So there's the history to that decision. I must admit, I do feel a little bit like the kid who's been given the car keys to their dad's classic car. So I'm going to try not to crash it. A lot of expectation here, given the quality of the podcast that you put out. But to be fair, and for all of those that listen, I think there are some really key lessons and parts of advice that I'd like to pull out today. Probably less of a this is your life, but really to get some thoughts. You, Mark, and also Bill have got some incredible experiences and seen a lot of different economic times and different perspectives. And I think it'd be really good to share some of that.
Well, that's interesting, Jeremy, that comment about economic times. I was telling somebody about for the stock exchange crash. I think it was 87 or around that. Mm-hmm. And I happened to be in the main street of Japan, in Tokyo, that day when it happened, and came home to a business that was in real trouble. And they said, what was the stock exchange crash all about? And I thought, oh, you're getting older.
Well, I thought we might start, because you do like to go through a little bit of a history just to provide some context. And rather than go through some of the standard questions, I'm just interested perhaps if you can start with sharing, what are some of the experiences perhaps from childhood or early life that you think might have played a role in terms of who you are and what your values are today?
Well, I guess as like many people, a lot of it comes back to my parents, and I was brought up in a family business, and the cabinet or committee of control was at the kitchen table. So I was learning by osmosis, unbeknown to myself at that stage, and it started in a pub in Yarrawonga, and I remember that vividly as a young fella. And then we moved to a farm, and I remember all the issues around farming and dairying and growing fruit trees, and the struggles and how persistent my parents were, no matter what the times were. And then, of course, you have your schooling, and a lot of lessons learnt there that you don't realise you're learning until you actually leave. And probably the biggest lesson I learnt during those times, and I've never really telegraphed this, but I was head prefect at St Kevin's College. And they put me through a leadership course in that final year. And I think it was Lord Summers Camp or something like that. And I reckon that was a tipping point for me to want to get more involved in business and so forth. Yeah.
On my side, so my dad was an electrical engineer. And I can remember from an early age him saying, don't become an electrical engineer. And what's topical at the moment is he actually was one of the engineers building a nuclear power station in Scotland. So I follow with interest the debate over nuclear power stations. But on my mum's side, her dad ran a corner shop and was always in food and so on. And he always used to talk about the retail side of things. So when I went through uni to become a school teacher, thinking that's where I wanted to go, and then realised when I finished, no, that's not what I wanted to do, I stepped into retailing and have never looked back. And I think it was the work ethic of my father, my grandfather up until he died in his 80s, every morning got up, did his exercises, put on a suit and tie or a tie and a shirt, and always said it's how you present yourself to the world. So a lot of that is, it's interesting what you learn. Is it nature or nurture, I suppose, is the question.
Good question. And I think part of that also ties in with mentors. And I know both of you are particularly passionate about having the right mentors and the right advisors around you in different parts of life. So I'm interested to know, can you think of a significant mentor or a person in your career that's deeply impacted the journey that you've been on?
I can think of a couple actually, and there weren't many around when I was in my sort of 20s and starting a business. But one was actually, once again, it goes back to school. It was the school chaplain. And I was living with a family in Melbourne, and I was a bit confused about a few things, and I didn't really know who to go to, and I ended up being the school chaplain. And for the next 5 years, I would go and see him 3 times a year, and we'd just have a chat, and he was a great sounding board, and that's what it was. And then later on, when I was in business, was actually the managing director of a big opposition company to my own business that we once a month, we'd go out for lunch, sometimes a long lunch, but he took it upon himself, I guess, to mentor me, and it was a mutual arrangement, but I learnt so much from him. I realised the value of having somebody to talk to, or in confidence, no holds barred, but who had more to offer probably back to me than I had to give back to them.
I suppose from my end, in my early retail career, there were a couple of store managers that I worked for that went over and above to sit down and talk about where do you want to go, what are you trying to do, and they made a profound influence on my direction. There were others that I thought, I am never ever going to be like you, so that pushed me in a different way. I've got 3 schoolmates that I have been friends with since we went through high school together, and we catch up pretty regularly every 6 months or so. Great sounding board because they know me well, I know them well, and they tell me exactly what they think, which is good. And more recently, which is not that recent, but for the last 11, 12, 13 years, we've been meeting every Friday morning for breakfast with a group.
First
Friday of the month.
Yeah.
Sorry. There's about 11 of us.
Yeah.
And that group is fantastic to be able to talk about issues and what you're trying to do. And it's a different group, a totally disparate group. We don't see each other outside of that group, probably, but Bill and I. But that's a great sounding board. So that mentoring, not as an official capacity, but it's there on a regular basis.
And Jeremy, the obvious is in front of you. Since we started doing these podcasts 2 years, we are actually mentoring each other.
It's true. So it's very true.
It's amazing how it works out.
You guys are too connected sometimes.
Yeah.
I thought, just given the current economic and business climate, it might be worth actually drawing upon some thoughts from you in some similar times that you might have been to. And quite specifically, is there a particular moment in time where you may have been in a business yourselves or advising others where they were going through that stumbling or failing and perhaps in some unfavourable conditions? Really interested to know how business owners and leaders might be able to approach digging themselves out of that situation, which a lot of them are in currently.
Yeah, well, yes, I have been through those times. And as much as I probably didn't realise at the time, it taught me a few lessons. But more recently, of course, COVID's the most recent example. And I've had clients, mainly, I specialise in family business. I've had family business clients that when COVID came, they weren't prepared. And they didn't have what we call a contingency plan. But more importantly, they'd never had the conversation of what happens if. And no one ever never met any family business that has sat down and had a conversation and said, right, here we are now to 2019, I think it was, or 18, and said, if this happens, what do we do? And I've got a very quick story is that with families now, and one of my first questions when we get into things is, have you got a will? And generally the answer is no, unfortunately. So contingency planning is about, well, let's have a meeting and I put Dad down the back and announce to the family, who are generally the business leaders, okay, Dad died last night. What happens tomorrow? They can't answer the question. So they're not prepared for the turnaround. Now, the successful ones who have had some plan in place and know who is going to step into the breach when something goes wrong. And I guess a significant point about surviving any downturn is to have a solid balance sheet, right? Have cash reserves and not be in too much debt, and if need be, make the tough decisions and cut back where you can without killing the business. And I guess that's sort of a general summary.
Mark, before you answer the same question, probably worth also just addressing perhaps the question of risk, because that does come into it, doesn't it? What your risk appetite is at any stage of business, and then how prepared you may be, to face some of the downturns in life. And
I suppose a lot of it is people don't think it'll happen to them. So that, if I think back over my career, the GFC and Paul Keating and the recession we had to have and all those sorts of things. I mean, I can remember being a store manager and getting the phone call to say, righto, this is what your wage budget is. You need to get rid of all these staff and reduce back, and working extremely hard to make sure the business survived, because everything's in a cycle. It will get better. It's just how you ride that wave to make it better. And also from the risk point of view, looking at it and saying, what are the roles I need to keep? What are the roles I don't need to keep? And I'm a big believer in driving the marketing when things go down, because a lot of business, I'm not saying most, but a lot of businesses, the first thing they'll cut is, and I had a comment to Bill the other day about this, they'll cut training, they'll cut marketing, because it's seen as an expense. But when things are tough, you probably need to keep your marketing up to make sure you're out there and competing and saying you're in business and get things going. So, I mean, I've ridden through lots of ups and downs in the whole retail game, and in the recession we had to have. I remember we went for 2 years in the corporate world where there were no pay reviews. You didn't get one because things were tough, and you kept your job. And you knew when you came out of it, things would get better. So it's always a cycle, but don't give up. Focus on what you do well, and it's a good opportunity to look through the things that you can get out of. What are the jobs you don't need to do? What are the things that you're spending money on you shouldn't spend money on? But don't give up on marketing, and don't give up on your people and training and developing those.
Yeah, Jeremy, if you want an example, just look at the agribusiness, look at farmers. And we did a podcast, which we released last week, about Meredith Dairy. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened there was, and this is a classic answer to your question, I guess, is that 1990, the bottom fell out of the wool market, and they were primarily woolen crops. So it forced them to rethink, and Julie Cameron had a marketing flair, or she was a nurse from background, and her husband was a vet, and they were out of that recession, or that drop in that wool market, is now you've got a $40 million cheese company that's successful everywhere. You just don't know. You don't know what's next. But if you sit there and say, woe is me, you'll never survive. That's the issue.
I've been pretty soft on you so far, so we might get into a couple of things. One thing I'm conscious of is that both of you are incredibly good at playing that advisor role, working with business and sharing your expertise. So if we perhaps just put this back on you individually and personally for a minute, we spoke about business decisions just then, Mark, around what you do during the downturns, but I think ultimately all the business leaders know that we make mistakes, myself included. So can you share a moment where you may have made a mistake or failed? And I'm quite interested to know how that experience might have shaped what you did subsequently post that mistake you may have made.
I'll go back to a business I started when I was in my 20s. It was a soft drink company, and many people listening to this know my father had Noddy Soft Drinks in Geelong, which he started in 1959, and I couldn't work for him, so I went and started my own business in Melbourne. And away I went and never looked back, and I did it all on a wing and a prayer, a wish and a prayer. And I got to the point where I woke up one morning and I said, I grew too fast, right? We were showing profits, but I didn't have any cash left. And in my office, I had a whiteboard, and every night when I went home, I put the bank balance, I wrote it in red up the top, and it was in a big fat minus. And I made a decision that I'd seek help. And we got the Monash MBA school to come in and use my business as a case study. And I read what they said, and I thought, it's your own fault. You grew too fast and you didn't have the right strategy. And then just quickly from there, I went and ran a division of Cadbury Schweppes. And I looked back and said, if I had have had the disciplines and some of the corporate protocols and financial disciplines in my business, I'd probably still... but that's wishing your life away. But that was the lesson. I went head first on a huge expansion program, and it backfired.
Was the mistake that you'd neglected the awareness of the financial position, and that subsequently forced you to perhaps pay a bit more attention?
I should. I had brought my brother into the business. I gave him half my business towards the end because I realised that, because he was the financial person. I was the operations. I was the thinker of products and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And that was the mistake. Right? So would I do it again? No, I wouldn't. And I'd get, what I'd do? I'd get mentors. There you go.
There you go. Good learning from the mistake.
It's a good question. I've been while Bill's been yakking on, I've been thinking back over and there's lots of things that I went left instead of right or right instead of left. I suppose one that I was talking about with my oldest son, who's with us at the moment, is way back when I was in my Target career. I got a phone call from a department store called Ahern's, which used to exist in Western Australia, and they were looking to someone to come over and run the business. And I sat at home and ummed and ahed and thought, no, I'm happy where I am. I shouldn't go that way. No, because it was a risk and I wasn't willing to take the risk to change. Now, my career from that day is a fantastic career, no issue. But I know people that went into that business that then got bought by David Jones, and one of them then went on to become the CEO of David Jones. And I often think, what if I hadn't been as cautious? So coming round to today, my son has just come back from 6 months in Japan. My daughter's just come back from 6 months in Europe. And both of them have said, right, we're going to go and travel, we're going to do... And we've been right behind them to do it. Part of the caution is, what are you going to do when you get back and you need to earn more money? But supporting them to take the risk, because I think in my early days, I wasn't game to take the risk. And that was probably a mistake. I should have jumped at the risk.
That might be a good lead on, Mark. And I'm going to go with you first to give Bill the opportunity to think for once. Having seen a number of industries and worked across a number of generations of business owners and leaders as well, how do you feel about the emerging generation of entrepreneurs and leaders? And do you see any changes in the qualities and the mindsets that are coming through from perhaps newer businesses and newer leaders compared to those of previous years? Yeah,
I think there seems to be more of a risk-taking. Hence, that's probably a nice connection back to me in that, whether I'm quite cautious or was reasonably cautious, I must admit I've made some other risky decisions over the years, but the entrepreneurs today seem to willing to have that go and have that attempt to go somewhere. I do sometimes look and think, have they thought of the risk in terms of the impact on those around them? So it's all very well for them to take the risk and run, but then when it folds, if it does fold, what's the damage around them? Because they're looking after themselves and they're a bit self-centric. But sometimes you've got to be self-determined. You've got to say, I'm going to have a go and run at it and get there. So, I think people are more willing to take a bit more risk these days, I think, Bill.
Yeah, I do agree. And it's interesting, Jeremy, because as you know, the Chamber's running the Business Awards at the moment, and Mark and I are judges on that, and we go and visit many businesses, and you see a diversity of this, isn't it? And the younger, you're right about the risk. 2 or 3 female business owners who I visited recently took a risk and jumped out of corporate to take up their passion. And that's the sort of thing that didn't happen in the past. And what you've got now is the next generation more agile. They're not afraid to change things. They don't sit there saying, "Oh, I inherited this business," or "I've moved into this business and my parents started, my grandfather started it," and they're the ones that are not prepared to take the risk. But the generations come into it now, and this is the other comment I get. People often say to me, "Oh, why don't you promote your son or daughter or whatever it is?" And, "Oh, they're too young." No, they're never too young. Right? Just as much as I'll say to myself, "You're never too old." Right? But you're right, Mark. It's a faster moving world. You've got to be more agile, and you've got to be prepared. See, people don't look long term. It's a bit like the superannuation issue. Young people don't care about it. The older generation, when they were in there working for the bank and the corporates, they used to really monitor their superannuation. But now it doesn't matter. I'd rather have a go, have a crack, and they don't think, well, what if it doesn't work?
And gone are the days, I spent 30 plus years with one company, constantly changing within that. So you could argue it was different roles and different jobs every time I changed, but it was one company. That's gone by the by. Most CVs that I see now when people are looking for people, they've got 2 years here, 2.5 years here, 3 years there, if you're lucky, and that's because people are looking for the opportunity. And I've had to change my mindset a bit, because in the past I would look and go, "Oh, they're a gypsy. They just keep moving. Why would I invest in them?" But if you invest in folk and they develop and do well for you for 2 to 3 years, great. Move on to the next person.
Oh, Jeremy, I had the classic recently where I went into this business and I'd never had a budget. And I did a budget, and in it I put in $2,500 for each employee for training. The owner said to me, "Why would you do that?" Right? "Because you train them up, all they're going to do is leave." And I had to bite my tongue, sit there in silence.
This is probably a topic for another day, but I was speaking to a business owner recently who takes sympathy with the current crop of employees, that it's actually the culture of employers that aren't investing enough to keep them and have them. Those 30-year careers are obviously less frequent, Mark, and that you do need to often jump to find the development you require, because that type of longevity in training development isn't there. I did see a stat the other day, Bill, that the average amount spent on development per employee in Australia is about $800 per employee, but nearly 75% of that is spent in onboarding through either training or compliance or setup. So out of that's not very much there.
Well, that's not personal development, is it?
It's not at all.
Now, sorry, Jeremy, did you realise that when, going back to the ancients, when I was in business, it was compulsory to spend 3% on training? It was a government legislation.
Correct.
There you go. We won't get into government legislation today, that's for sure. Bill, if you think about perhaps in your maybe 20s, 30s, and when you had a different eye on success, have your personal views on success changed over time?
No, not. I don't believe they have at all, and because it's over that 40 years now, I'm just thinking how old my children are. My success has always been about family, right? And I've never deviated from that. So,
in what sense is it providing for or having time for?
So you're doing things. When you're doing things, it's and you're working whatever situation. Why are you working? Well, you're working for yourself. There's no doubt about that, for your own well-being and your own satisfaction. But what's driving that? And a young family, when you you started a young family and all that. That's always in the back of my mind that what you're doing is helping to educate them, helping to learn experiences, helping them to travel and all the rest of it. So it's been a family motivation. I've never had any great ambition to be the leader of somebody or to be up in lights or anything like that. It's a case of what drives me, and right now what drives me probably equally as I did in those days is grandchildren, netball, basketball, soccer, right? You name it. But no, get back to your primary question. I haven't had any altruistic ambition or goal that it's about me being up in lights, but I do enjoy having success. There's no doubt about that, and I strive hard for that.
Mark, have your views on success changed over time?
No, I think I'm a bit like Bill. I think whatever I did or wherever I jumped to was to try and improve the family lot, to give the base that, and it can come about wealth, I suppose, but it was having a good financial base so that I knew that the kids and everybody, my wife, we were set. But my wife worked twice as hard as I did in different roles too. But it was always about having fun, enjoying what we did. And if you didn't enjoy what you did, then you looked to move into something else. But also having that base for the family to grow and not want, I suppose. That was always my drive and still is. I still keep I like to be challenged, so I like to keep things happening. People say to me, well, when will you retire? No, I don't think there's ever such a day that today I'm going to stop everything, because I like to be challenged, but I also like to keep involved and see things happen. And I like working with people. I enjoy working and mentoring people.
I think, Jeremy, I can relate to that because I love having a challenge. And I go bonkers if I haven't got a challenge in front of me. That gets me into trouble sometimes, I might add. But I look at my history, right? I went to 5 schools. I've lived in something like 20-something different permanent addresses in my life, right? In 3 different countries. And I couldn't tell you how many businesses I've worked with or come across in my working life as a mentor consultant. And I think it's challenge.
It's challenge.
You've got to have a challenge. Yeah.
Now, one thing I have learned, and it's in part due to the success of this podcast, is to keep to the shorter format. So I think we've got probably 2 more questions. I'm interested to get your thoughts in terms of the business landscape and quite possibly the greater Geelong region for us here. What excites you the most, and what do you think business success is going to look like here over the next few years and into the future?
Well, we're in a perfect position right now, and I don't talk about the past, and I have little patience for those that talk about Geelong in the past. It's all about the future. When you look at what's going on, in simple issues like Avalon Airport, the port, what the white collar, the office situations, the development that's going on. But there's 22,000 small businesses or businesses in Geelong, of which I venture to say 20,000 or more are small businesses. And that's how I believe Geelong's going to thrive. We can't stop progress. And there is absolutely no doubt if we're sitting here by Easter next year, I have no doubt we'd be talking about an economy that's really on the go. But, the cranes are going up, all these sorts of things. It's a town that lives by sport. It lives by the sea. It's got great schools. It's got a great university. It can only go forward. And that's my take on Geelong.
We can't stop progress. That sounds like a placard we can use,
That's
Mark.
right.
What are your views, Mark? What's the most exciting proposition at the moment that's out there?
I think the game changer for Geelong would be the convention centre. It's been talked about and talked about and talked about. And the other day I ducked into, through my role in the Geelong Authority, we popped into the Deakin student car park. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't, go up on the roof and you look over the convention centre. That's unbelievable how fast that's come out of the ground. but also the impact that will have on Geelong in bringing people here. And if you're a small business that's in hospitality or in tourism or whatever, you should be looking at that now and saying, how do I get a chunk of that? How do I work with that organisation? And they're taking bookings. I hope the Chamber's got the booking in there for the Business Awards for when it opens, 2026.
We're working on it.
But I think that's going to be a massive change. And I think I'm hoping over the next few years, then the art gallery will get its chance to expand into the where we're sitting, the Old Council Chambers, because that'll then drive the whole arts precinct and wrap that up, and Geelong will just keep going. We could talk about Market Square and where that'll be, but something will happen. It'll change. But then Geelong will have that vibrancy and it's growing. It's, there's lots of naysayers about, you can't walk through Geelong and there's lots to do in Geelong. There's lots of good places to eat. There's lots of things to do. So,
Jeremy, the cycles between boom and bust, if you want to give it that name, is actually shortened. And Bernard Salt's got a great presentation he does that shows you that going right back, there were 20-year, 25-year time spans between that. And he said now it can be 10. And that's what we've got to learn to do. We've got to be prepared to anticipate it's not always going to be on the upside. And we've just got to manage accordingly. Yep. That's what we have to do.
Last question, and possibly one of the most poignant questions, and I'm sure our readers will be, our listeners, I should say, will be really interested. In those quieter moments, how do you reflect on the journeys that you've had, and really interested to know what part of your career or perhaps life are you personally most proud of?
I would say my time at Target. Actually, no, there's two parts. One, the achievements we had at Target. It pains me today to look at where Target is because we did some great things, took the business in great direction. The other thing that I really enjoyed was my 5 years running Fags Mitre 10 in Geelong, working with Keith and Barry Fag. I really loved that. That was fantastic. It's now part of a corporate entity, but those 5 years or 4 and a bit years running it as a family business with them learning and how it changes, that was great fun. So I have no regrets. I look back and go, gee, we did some good stuff. And it's only when you sit down and start talking to people that work with you and you start talking through things, you think, we achieved a lot. Target, when I look back at one stage, made a loss, the first loss it had ever made, and we turned it around to make a record profit. And that's a great achievement because that kept people employed. That was when people were saying, oh, it's dead. Who knows where it goes? But yeah, no regrets over looking back. But those were probably the two that I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, I guess, Jeremy, well, I don't guess, I know, it was starting my own business at age 24 and running that for some 15 or 18 years. And as I said before, well, I made some mistakes, but that doesn't matter. But they were exciting times, and we had a lot of success. And that was I look back on that and say, well, I don't regret anything I did there. And a couple of others were after I sold that business and started working for corporations. I was running some couple of large company subsidiaries that were losing bucket loads of money, and I loved the success we had in those business turnarounds. And I think back on that and think, I can hang my hat up on that and move on. Now, what am I going to be doing in the future? Like Mark, I have no idea. But each year brings a different challenge. And I love a challenge. Yeah.
Well, just on that note, the Chamber's very proud to have you in the network. And for those that have interacted with either or both of you, and we often talk about Bill and Mark as being a pair, which is not necessarily a comedy duo, but it can get quite funny. Look, I'm also really grateful and thinking about things such as in a world of tech and AI and being able to Google anything, the richness of conversation that we often have, whether it's at an event or in passing or, in some quieter moments, there's some incredible insight. And we speak a lot about knowledge transfer and IP transfer in business. being able to draw upon some knowledge from two individuals like you who, let's be honest, have seen all forms of business conditions and sizes and types of business and the pitfalls and the highs and lows, etc. And I think sometimes people forget that those human interactions can be more fulfilling than setting about trying to create a new strategy or whatever it is that you think is the most important part in business. So I just also want to thank you for accepting the opportunity to be your own guest. And I feel like there might be a few topics that we could perhaps follow up on, maybe after a few other external guests, and we can check in again on both of you perhaps in the future.
Fantastic, Jeremy. Thank you and thank you for asking us, because
That's right.
we weren't thinking of doing a 100th celebration, so thank you.
And as we keep saying, Mark, life is full of tipping points,
Yep.
and we're all about conversations. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks both.
Great.